Oh, hi there. Oli Anderson here. You're listening to Creative Status. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. This is a place where we talk about how the creative process is actually a process of growing real. Growing real means that we're becoming more authentic, that we're unpacking our true values, our true intentions, that we're stepping away from social programming, from emotional self-hypnosis that keeps us down and keeps us stuck, and ultimately that we can make the unconscious conscious and move towards wholeness instead of a fragmented and divided state within ourselves. Today's interview is with Lauren Spangler. Lauren is a creativity coach and an artist and a strategist. And I really enjoyed this conversation a lot because we ended up talking about death, which is one of my favorite topics, but also because we took it a little bit deeper than usual in the sense of normally we look at how creativity can help us become more real, which just means that we improve our relationship with ourselves. In this episode, we talk about how we can improve our relationship with creativity itself, how we can clear away some of the mental cobwebs, I guess, that are keeping us stuck, how we can be more outcome independent, how we can just use anything that happens in our lives as a kind of springboard for getting where we need to be, and ultimately just having the attitude required to get to that real place that I keep talking about. So Lauren, that was an awesome conversation we had. Thank you so much. Everybody else, thank you for listening. If this podcast helps you in any way, shape or form, and you feel like sharing it with someone or leaving a review, that would be most appreciated. But either way, here we go. Enjoy the conversation. Boom. Oh, hi there, Lauren. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Creative Status. We're going to be kind of exploring the idea of healthy relationships between ourselves and our creativity, so we can move towards wholeness. That could lead us in any direction. Before we get onto all that, do you feel like introducing yourself, telling people what you're all about, what you do, and also what you want to get out of this conversation?
Sure, Ollie. Thank you so much for having me. It's a treat to be here with you. I'm Lauren Spangler. I'm a creativity coach. I'm also a painter, a musician, a writer, and a wife, and a mom of 2 young boys. So there is never a dull day at my house. And man, I'm just so excited to talk with you about creative wholeness and healthy relationships with our creativity and how that can help us experience a sense of wholeness. Just really excited to dig in.
I'm getting very excited hearing you use all these words like creativity and wholeness. I like to rant and rave about wholeness every day as part of my self-care routine. So I think this is a good opportunity for me to dive into that a bit more. Let's start right at the beginning. So there's all kinds of definitions that people use about creativity just as a thing, like what it even is. How do you see creativity, I guess, as a creative person doing all those things that you mentioned, painting and writing, but also helping other people with your coaching business to kind of tap into their, I guess, core essence of creativity, or however you want to describe it? I'm putting words in your mouth now, but how do you define creativity, basically, based on everything you've seen?
I think creativity is actually pretty simple. I think we're all creative. I think creativity is just the act of making something that wasn't there before. And that could be as simple as a connection between 2 things. It could be something we think of as a traditionally creative act, like creating a painting or a song or a poem. It could be baking a cake, putting an outfit together. You and I are creating a conversation right now. We're creating connections between thoughts, connections between people. All of these things are creative acts to me. And I think different people go about cultivating their creativity in different ways. And people who have decided to devote their life to creativity in some capacity just have a more intentional and more invested approach in how they're relating to their creativity and what they're pulling out of that relationship.
Yeah, that's awesome. So ultimately, it's a kind of universal thing that we all have in some capacity, but like some of us, I guess, take it a little bit more, maybe seriously is not the right word. We treat it with a bit more reverence, let's say, because of what we think it can do for us, where others have maybe a bit more of a passive approach, but it's still there in all cases because it's actually just a very human thing. Where does the wholeness come into it? Just to kind of crack this open, like, how does creativity align with wholeness as a whole? Which is a weird way of saying that.
No, I know what you mean. I think for some people, creativity is a frame of mind or an approach that is imbued into everything that they do throughout their day, and it's not really a conscious act. For other people, I think that there's this urge, this desire to go create something, that they feel this pull to go write their book or to go, make their album or like whatever it is. And for that second set of people, I think if they are not engaging with the creativity in that really intentional container, in that really intentional way, I think there can be this sense that something's lacking. There can be this sort of like hunger or this feeling like they're craving this activity, and when they're not attending to it and they're not spending time there, sort of like there's this piece of themselves that's not getting daylight. And I think when they start to act upon that desire to go make something, it can feel like now they're sort of circulating oxygen through all the different parts of themselves, right? And their personality. And that can be a really gratifying sensation. And I think sometimes when we consider ourselves artists, or we consider ourselves creative people, like capital C, capital P, like we are creative. You used this really interesting term earlier. You said like, we take it seriously, and then you kind of cross that out. And you're like, actually not seriously, we're just more invested. But that's interesting because this thing happens where deeply creative people start to take it too seriously and actually block themselves into this sort of like serious, rigid space. And they lose a lot of the play and a lot of the sort of lightheartedness and curiosity that I think actually fuels their creativity. And that's one of the places where I think they can start to chip away at their own sense of wholeness, because when they get into that space where they're being creative and they're wanting to relate to themselves creatively, if they're doing so with too much seriousness, too much rigidity, it can start to feel frustrating. And so I think wholeness, so back to the topic of wholeness, I think when we're really clear on what we want out of our relationship with our creativity, and then when we're taking steps to do that and to bring that into our daily experience each day, it starts to round out the way we're experiencing ourselves, the way we're experiencing our life, and it starts to bring a sense of fulfillment and wholeness.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like, I think there's so many things you've just kind of talked about that have kind of opened up some of the deeper themes around creativity as a whole. And it all comes back to the idea that creativity is something that we all have. It's part of our nature, but that our attitude towards it is going to affect where those creative impulses are going to take us. And as you were talking, I kind of broke it down into 3 different levels, which I've kind of seen now quite a bunch of times on the podcast and just in general with people. But it goes basically, there's one level of creativity where it's almost like people are trying to prove themselves in some way. Like they're trying to create something in the serious way that you've talked about, not the playful way, which is a bit more real in my opinion. They take their creativity very seriously because they want to prove to the world that a certain image that they carry of themselves is the truth, even though that image may just exist as a kind of way of compensating for underlying emotional stuff, shame, guilt, and trauma, as I normally say it. And that first approach, it's kind of a choice about the creativity that's causing them to try and cling to the ideas they already have, let's say. The second approach is that some people just use their creativity as a way of just putting themselves in a place of being. So instead of being a human doing, as people say, they're just being. And so they're just creating something for the sake of it. Maybe they're doodling or they're just painting a picture, and the unconscious is becoming conscious in that process. But ultimately they're just being. Like they're not trying to get anywhere and they're not trying to prove anything. They're just being. And then the third level is kind of the one that I normally end up ranting and raving about, which is where we're using our creativity as a way of consciously growing more real or towards wholeness. And like these elements, these three elements of either trying to prove something, or just be, or to grow, I suppose they're all interconnected. But I think like if we make the conscious choice to learn to listen to ourselves and those creative pulls that you talked about, then 90% of the time, those pulls are some unconscious thing from the shadow self, I believe, calling us to either release something or to integrate something so that we can move towards wholeness. And the creativity in that third sense can be a conscious vehicle for growing. Obviously, like, that does sound very serious, but I think if we take that playful attitude as we go down that path and we don't overthink it, even though I'm clearly overthinking right now, then we can use our creativity to consciously become more whole, because we have to be more responsive to ourselves, and then we have to kind of trust the process of following those creative pulls where they want to take us, so we can, I guess, release the things that aren't making us whole. So I've thrown loads and loads at you right there. I apologize for the verbiage, but what do you think about, I guess, that deeper level of kind of using our creativity to grow, and how does it maybe contrast to the other two levels, if you think it does?
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that. I hadn't heard, I love that way of breaking it down into these tiers of prove, be, and grow, because I think as creatives, we're all sort of like fluidly moving through all of those at any given time. You know, I know a lot of creatives who spend a lot of their time up at the top of that sort of evolution, where they really are sense making with their art, and they're very conscious in how they're impacting the world with what they're making, or themselves what they're making. And but they still have days, right, where they wake up and that ego kind of rears its ugly head, and they're like, I gotta go show somebody I know my stuff, right? Like, I'm gonna go make this great thing to be great, right?
Yeah.
So I think we all sort of, I would say we oscillate among those three things, and part of building a healthy creative mindset is being able to be conscious of where you're falling on that scale in a given moment, in a given point in your career, you know, or a moment within your practice even, and being able to use that consciousness to then pull yourself up a level or two and sort of move into that most meaningful space where you really are filling your full capacity as a creator to be making sense through your work, and to be bringing true meaning through and forward. I like to think of it, I always go back to this principle that there's a relationship between an artist and their own creativity, and that relationship has various states of health, just like any relationship between two people or entities, right? And so if I was going to try to overlay your three tiers with my philosophy of like the creative relationship, it totally matches. I think there's a lot of alignment there, because in the lowest tier, where you're trying to prove something, I think about that in terms of an artist whose relationship with creativity is oriented around the approval of others, oriented around external validation. And if you think about, you know, I liken it to any important relationship in your life, you know, a relationship with a friend or a loved one or a significant other or a business partner. In all of those relationships, we have to be really intentional about the type of the way we're treating the other, the energy we're bringing into that connection, and what we're expecting back out of it, and the clarity we feel on why we're connected to that person, and, you know, what service we bring them and what they're giving back to us. And all of those things are places where we can either enrich and deepen the relationship and the connection, or where we can sort of undermine ourselves and shoot ourselves in the foot and set our relationship up to fail and be painful and difficult, right? And so back to these three tiers, an artist who is creating for the sole purpose of proving their skill or their worth, really, in my mind, they're not relating to their creativity in a whole and fulfilling way. Yeah. They're using their creativity to try to pander and appeal to others. And it's so tempting and easy to do that. We've all fallen into that trap. I know that I will fall into that trap many more times before my career is over. It happens because it feels good to get a gold star and a pat on the back, and we want someone else to say, hey, you're good at this. But if that's the sole driver for our relationship, our creativity, I think we're really building something hollow. And over time, we're going to start feeling the lack of strong foundation in that relationship. So if we move up one tier into, you talked about artists using their creativity as a way to be, as a vehicle for presence and like being in the moment. I would say for me, probably this is my default at this moment. Like if I go into my studio and I can just be with my work, that's a pretty good day for me. Like, I would be okay with that. And then I love those days when I'm able to transcend even further and like find this meaning. And that's great when that happens. But most days I'm happy to just be present and be able to let go of the things outside of me and my work in the moment. So in that moment, I would liken that experience to someone who's really present in a relationship and who is enjoying the company of the other person. In my relationship with my kids, I strive to be present, to just be with them is great. And that's sort of, I think, an honorable goal. But then if we can move up one level to that top tier you described, where creativity is a vehicle for meaning making and for really attaining this sense that we are bringing our deepest gifts to bear and bringing them out into the world and like doing something meaningful. In my mind, that's a relationship where you have a deep and abiding connection with someone. You both feel a sense of like shared vision. Like you're not just looking at each other, you're looking at in the same direction, right? Some of us have been lucky enough to have a best friend or a partner who we feel that sense of connection and synergy with, where like, yes, you're my spouse and I enjoy spending time with you and I enjoy being beside you, but also together, shoulder to shoulder, we are pointed in the same direction. We have the same vision. We have the same dreams. We're building this life together and I'm looking out 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years with you in what reality I want us to create together. And that is the most fulfilling and meaningful type of connection. And I think artists can build that and can have that level of connection with their creativity as well.
You're just giving such an amazing breakdown of all these different tiers, as we're calling them. I think, in a way, there's a theme emerging here around, like, intimacy, if you want to call it that. Like, I think, in terms of what we've been saying about relationships, I think the healthiest relationships, the most real relationships, are the ones with the least barriers to intimacy. And in relation to like these tiers that we've now brought into the conversation, if we enter a relationship with ourselves or with others or with life at that first level of just trying to prove ourselves ultimately, then we come in from a very fragmented place. We're fragmented in the sense of being disconnected from our fundamental core being, ultimately, which is what causes us to create the ego, the false image, false version of ourselves that constantly needs validation from the outside world to continue existing because it doesn't actually have any grounding in anything. And so if we approach relationships as a vehicle for kind of proving to ourselves that we're who we think we need to be to compensate for all of the underlying emotional stuff, then we're going to have a fragmented relationship ultimately that is always going to have barriers to communication and to that intimacy, which is just two people really seeing each other in the realest possible way. The next level about being, like, also ultimately, like, being is what it's all about. Like, we want to get to a point where we're being, like, we're just being ourselves, which ultimately means we're just enjoying, I suppose, a moment of intimacy, let's say, between ourselves and life and between ourselves and whatever it is that we're doing, in this case, creating a piece of art or something. But I think being is often misconstrued as being about just stillness, but actually being is about putting ourselves back in the flow, I think. Like, when we're really present, things are still moving. Like, ultimately, like, you know, the present moment is just motion from one moment to the next. And if we can put ourselves in that flow, so to speak, then we're going to end up eventually flowing towards wholeness. But if we can get to that third level, then we can flow towards wholeness in a more conscious way, because we are just being, but we also understand that our being needs to bring in the vision ultimately that you talked about, which is the thing that gives us a direction to be able to use as we navigate those moments of being from one to the next, if that makes sense. And
yes,
the relationship quality as we do that, whether it's just a relationship with ourselves and life and knowing what our vision is based on where we're going, when we've kind of transcended is a strong word, but stepped back from that need to prove ourselves, which is blocking this natural expression of a vision that's probably always there. But the quality of the relationship with a vision it's going to be more long-lived than a relationship that is just about being, if that makes sense. And so
yeah,
I am rambling a lot, but there's something here about the healthy relationship with our creativity in relation to, I guess, being present, but also moving at the same time, and how we, sorry, I can tell you're going to...
No, you call it rambling. I call it digging deep. I'm loving it, Oli. I think this is good stuff. I think...
I'm no longer a rambler. I'm a dig deep.
Deep digger. I think that's great. I think wonderful. Yeah. I think I would bring in the word purpose.
Yeah.
I would say when we're being, I agree with you completely. It's dropping in flow. It's allowing yourself to be present with what is. And man, I've tried meditation in the traditional, like sitting on a meditation pillow, like eyes closed. I've tried that so many times, and I've never been able to get past like 5 or 10 minutes. I cannot seem to break into that club of people who can be there sort of in this peaceful stillness for 20 to 30 minutes. I just can't do it. But I will tell you, when I do feel a heightened state of mindfulness and awareness and like transcendence of like the daily whatever, is when I'm doing dishes.
Wow.
Don't know what it is about doing dishes, the repetitive motion, the ease of like, I know it, like I'm just scrubbing a plate, like this is easy. There's something about it where if I can get really mindful and I can get really aware and really in my body and in the moment, I can actually experience a deep level of peace when I'm doing these really mundane daily tasks. And I think it's the same in the studio, where if we can get into this space where sharpening our pencils is an act of creative like enjoyment, and where like watching how the paint is spread. Like I started working with watercolor a while ago, mostly as therapy for my perfectionism, because I could not control the watercolors the way I could control the other mediums I worked in. And like watching, as soon as I started to just like notice, like what is the doing? How is the pigment spreading? Oh wow, the water is moving in a way I didn't totally expect it to. What happens next? There's this same type of allowance and awareness that we can bring into a creative practice, where it can become this really peaceful, mindful act. And I think purpose comes in when we can both be in the moment, like deeply grounded in just what is happening now, and simultaneously be able to zoom out and say, okay, I have a finite number of years on this planet. Like we're about to go deep, Ollie. If I've got 100 years to work with, I'm lucky. And what am I doing with that time? Like the fact that I'm sitting here watching the watercolor flow across the paper feels meaningful to me. And why is that? And what am I wanting to bring? And what am I wanting to leave? And why am I spending my time this way? Because my time is finite and my time is precious. And when we get to that deep of a level and we can answer those questions for ourselves and come up with like a solid response where we know exactly why we're painting that painting, or exactly why we're having this conversation right now. I think that the union of this deep mindful act with this broader, like large scale alignment, that's where we find this purpose and this sense that the tiny little steps we're taking in the moment are in congruity with in congruence with this bigger purpose and reason for being. And if we're not afraid to go there with ourselves, and we're not afraid to sort of fumble through the dark at first and go, gosh, I don't know why, like there are all these little gremlins that'll come out as soon as you ask yourself that question, right? It can be a really challenging experience, but if you walk yourself through sort of those dark woods to find those answers, I think that's where we can really get in this fun space where creativity and artistry can move into this deeply personal, purposeful, and meaningful experience.
Yeah. First of all, I'm really happy that you kind of brought death into this conversation. I feel like if somebody mentions death, then it's a successful podcast, because ultimately it's
well, ring the bell then. Death bell.
For that particular word. But death is kind of the doorway into all this, because like if you accept death, memento mori, all that stuff, you start to make real choices. And ultimately, real choices as opposed to unreal ones, which I, for brevity, think are just the choices motivated by ego rather than the real stuff that's going on inside us. Real choices are always going to bring you back to your purpose. And if you have a sense of purpose, like you said, then it's no longer just about what you do, but it's also about how you do it, because everything that you're doing is kind of feeding into that sense of purpose, and it's allowing you to be present in the way we talked about, but it's also moving you forward. And I think if we have a sense of what our real purpose is, then it basically brings in like all of the levels we talked about so far, because initially we may set out to prove something to the world or whatever, but as we kind of go down the path towards manifesting our purpose, we're going to grow more real in the process, because it's going to challenge us to grow through all of those kind of outdated ideas about ourselves, or the fragmentation that we've kind of become attached to, and etc. And as we do move forward, we become more whole ultimately. And so this idea that you brought into the conversation about creative purpose, I think is kind of the linchpin for understanding a lot of these things. And so I suppose I've got two questions for you now. Like, one, in relation to what we were kind of trying to unpack about like a healthy relationship with our creativity, are we saying that it ultimately comes down to being purposeful with our creativity? But the second thing, which is going to open things up maybe a bit deeper, so bring death in if you can, like 100 million %. But like the other thing is like, how do we find that purpose? And I'd like to think it has something to do with what you said right at the start of the conversation about feeling the pull. And I think feeling that pull in many cases is about something beneath the surface telling us to get back on track ultimately with that purpose. So again, I've thrown loads at you, but is it all about creative purpose in terms of having a healthy relationship with our creativity? And then two, how do we start to become aware of what that is by listening to ourselves in life?
Yeah, I do think purpose is the keystone. I think that it may not be something that has to be a conscious element of every single day an artist. Like, it's not something you have to constantly be sort of wrapping yourself around the axle about. But I do think that if you haven't visited that topic and found some truths there, then it's one of those things you'll miss as you go along, and other things will start to unravel and crumble a little bit. So do I think it's all about purpose? I think that purpose is a key ingredient. It would be like making a cherry pie without the cherries. Like, you've got to have it somewhere in there or nothing's going to work right. And when I work with artists, this is where I always begin. Like, our first conversation is always about purpose. I sit them down and I say, look, you're going to die. No, I don't start there. But really, I do think that that's where most creative dysfunction stems from, is when we haven't had that conversation with ourselves around why we're doing what we're doing. So how do we figure that out? Typically, it's deeper than we think it is. There are several layers on top. We kind of have to dig through a lot of motivators that we've experienced in our lives and that drive our work, and all of those external sort of things are clues, and they sort of lead us down into this core where we can start to uncover what really is driving us. or maybe what is driving us and what we want to be driving us, which may be two different things. And then we reconcile that and we go about sort of mending and like recalibrating ourselves around the purpose we want to be driven by. One exercise that's useful that I would recommend if someone was listening to this conversation and wanting to sort of guide themselves through a process like that would be, through journaling or maybe a long walk or whatever, asking themselves why about 5 or 6 times, like a chain of 6 whys, okay, why am I doing this? Well, I'm doing this because I want to win such and such. Okay, why do I want to win that award? Well, because, my mother won that award and it's important to me that I rise to that same bar. Okay, why is that important? Well, because we have this legacy in my family of, we all are artists and we all, okay, well, why is legacy important to you? Why? Okay, you can dig down, you can dig deep, deep, deep in. Or, a different artist may ask themselves, why am I doing this? And decide that, I really want to write this book because I really want my kids to read it. Well, why do you want your kids to read it? Well, because I want to impart this, gem to them. Okay, why do you want to impart? Like if we can ask ourselves 5 or 6 times in a row, what is really motivating our actions and our desires? A lot of times, after about half a dozen rounds of that, we get down to these fundamental core values and we start to go, oh, I'm driven by play. When I'm in my studio and I'm in a painting, everything else kind of falls away when I can get in that flow zone and I can start to escape the like administrivia of my life or like whatever conflicts are distracted. Like I can forget all of that and I can just be in the zone, escape. Okay, well, why do I want to escape? Oh, because, and then we get deeper and deeper. So it might be play, it might be catharsis, it might be that we have something we deeply want to express. It might be that we have something we're trying to shine light on to bring others awareness. Everyone is going to have a different reason for why they do what they do. But if you can ask yourself over and over and over again until you get to like a 1-word answer, a 1 or 2 word answer, that's when you start to know that you're really circling in on the core motivators that can guide your creative life and can sort of become your North Star. Because when you peel away a lot of that external stuff, you peel away the award, you peel away the, whatever revenue goal that you might have for this year, or like when you peel all that external stuff away and you get down to like what actually matters to you, then when you layer the external pieces back on, you can do so with intentionality and you can say, okay, if what I'm really trying to experience is play, I always go back to that one a lot because I find that most of the clients I work with at the end of the day really enjoy the playful pieces of their work. But if it's play, right, then you can still go after that award. You can still hit that revenue goal, absolutely. But if you're doing it with a spirit of playfulness and wanting to spread that sense of play to others and wanting to share and make that playful spirit in your work a contagious thing and allow people into that sensation, you can still reach those external markers, but from a totally different angle than this sort of like egocentric, like scarcity based, like I better get that award or else, right? Or else I'm not going to feel good enough. I don't know. You put a lot into your question. I put a lot into my answer. I hope this feels like I'm actually answering what you asked, but I think it's possible for any artist to drill down to what that is. And if they're trying to do it alone, this is where a trusted friend or a creativity coach can help, because they can ask you those questions and help you sort of shine the light on the spaces you may not have seen or considered before.
Yeah. I think what you just shared is so important, because ultimately a lot of the time, unless we do some of that work of raising awareness ultimately by digging into our assumptions, then we're just running around on autopilot, not realizing that the assumptions that are driving us are either going to be real or unreal, to sound like a broken record. And this comes back to what we were saying about choices. Like ultimately, the only way to have a healthy relationship with your creativity and with life itself is to be acting intentionally, because you know that the choices you're making are coming from that realist part of you. And I think if we look at that three-pronged kind of tier system that we were talking about earlier, if you're at that earlier stage of you just trying to prove yourself to the world ultimately, then you kind of lost. Like, you had been driven by the right thing deep down, but because you don't know what it is, you end up in this trap that many people fall into, where you're looking for the right thing, which is wholeness, in fragmented places, let's say. And if you do some work, either consciously or because that system that you've built for yourself of kind of chasing these things eventually just runs out of steam and you have to confront yourself to some degree. If you do that work, then you're always going to end up back in the same place, which is you're going to be reunited with your creative purpose in the language you've been using, but also your being. Like, deep down, when you do that 5-6 whys exercise, it can only really lead to the things that give you that feeling of being, the things that make you feel most alive. And only if you consciously bring more of that stuff to the surface are you going to be able to kind of move in the direction that you want to move in. So it's super, super important. I suppose what I'm still
Absolutely. And this is where, oh, no, go ahead.
No, sorry, it's okay. Like, please go ahead. Like,
what? This is where I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in. Are you ready for a monkey wrench?
I'm always ready for a monkey wrench. Let's go.
So artists have this interesting conundrum, because we are answering all of these beautiful existential questions, and we have to be driven by these existential things, but within the constraints of our very real life. And so artists, especially professional artists, walk this line where they have to be driven by their deepest purpose, and they also have to be driven by needs and demands of their lifestyle. What do they require to support themselves? What are they, they're going to have to pay the mortgage next month, right? And so I think one place we get tripped up is many of us love to live in this sort of abstract, esoteric, nebulous space where we can talk for days about why we do what we do and why it's important. And then at some point, we got to go pay the bills. And I think that's one place that can be really challenging for artists to navigate, because they feel like these two things are at odds with one another. And so the other thing I love people is why do you do what you do, is why do you do what you do, and how can you support yourself to do that in a way that will give you the space and time that you need to reach those highest levels with your creativity, find that fulfillment and that experience that you want out of it. And so that's the other piece, because in this relationship we have with our creativity, one of the biggest strains can be money. It can be the financial reality that's pulling us in different directions and, causing us to fixate on some of those external markers. Because, as an artist, we never want to be driven by what someone else thinks. But as soon as that someone is a collector who's either going to pay you for your work or not, dang, it's hard not to be driven by what that person thinks, right? Yeah. So this is the other piece where I think it's critical for artists to sit down and get clear on what is the big picture for them, what is their purpose, and what are the tangible ways in they can support their creative spirit and so give themselves the financial stability that they need over the long run. And that's a hard question to answer, but I think it's a critical one.
Yeah. I think this is where it comes down to understanding that, I guess, two things. Like, first of all, creativity applies to everything, as we've kind of been saying. And so it's not just about creating our work. Like, on the deepest level, what we're actually doing is creating ourselves. And so everything that happens is actually fuel for creating this next version of ourselves, this next level of ourselves, I'd say, that's taken a step or two closer towards wholeness. And it doesn't need to be a massive step, but it needs to be some kind of a step. And we've always been invited ultimately to take the next step, like in every moment. Like, I seem to say this all the time recently, but like literally every moment, there's a choice between wholeness and fragmentation, between a connection to ourselves or to just go back to the old ways of kind of thinking and doing things that are kind of outdated software, let's say. So I think that's one important part of this, because even if, you know, we find ourselves as a, you know, like an artist or something, painting something just to make money, well, we can still use that challenge in some way to look at what we actually want in the long run and all that kind of thing, and to just become more solidified in our commitment to our purpose overall. Because we say, right, well, you know, right now I've got to take this commission or whatever so I can pay the mortgage, but ultimately my creative purpose and vision is going to lead me to a place where I'm not going to have to do this, because, you know, I'm just going to have artistic integrity all the time or whatever it is. But the other thing as well is nothing exists in isolation, does it? So it's kind of what you said, like, it's about understanding the bigger picture. And I think this is so vital and important, not just to creating like art in the traditional sense, but to, again, creating ourselves and like the real lives that we want to live. Like, life is just one big process. And I think we're all on this we're all on this journey from fragmentation to wholeness. We can always go deeper into wholeness as throughout the course of our lives. And then we die, of course, and we just become one with everything finally. But like, this journey of fragmentation to wholeness is always taking place. And so if we just look at things in isolation, like individual projects or individual scenarios and situations that pop up throughout the course of the day, then we kind of taken ourselves out of that flow. And I think we can get to this state where no matter what is going on, ultimately, and maybe it sounds a bit idealistic, but I really think we can live in this space. Like, no matter what's going on, we're just taking everything as fuel for that journey towards more wholeness. So even if something bad happens or something that deviates from our plan or vision, there's always going to be an opportunity. There's always going to be a lesson at the very least that's going to give us fuel for this wider journey towards our vision and purpose and all that stuff. That's how I see it. So
I don't think that's too idealistic. I think that's the goal. I think that's attainable. And I think the artists who I've worked with who are the happiest and who are able to maintain their inspiration and their consistency and their momentum over a long career have done that. I think that's the key. And I think a lot of times the fragmentation we're experiencing is like self-imposed because we have all of these preconceived notions around the value around what we're doing. What, like, is it worthy money if we're not making it with our art? Is it, does it make us less of an artist if we have an income stream that doesn't directly tie back to our core like passion? And I think if we can deconstruct a lot of the value charges we've placed on the various activities in our life, we can start to pull these things together and start to remove the polarities and go, you know what? Yeah, like the fact that I'm taking that commission is allowing me the space that, I can spend most of the day working on that commission, and then I can spend the last part of the day working on my passion project. And the two things are in harmony with each other.
Yeah.
They are supporting and feeding each other. And like you said, we're on this continuum. We're like on this path to ultimately like fulfilling this beautiful creative act of living our life. And if we can start to see these things as, even a day job, I would argue that, if you have, like I served coffee for a while, and for a long time, it was just like this never-ending source of frustration for me that I was like serving coffee, like, oh my gosh, I should be making music. I should be painting paintings. Like, why am I serving coffee? This seems completely perpendicular to everything that I say I want to do. And if I remove that value charge and go, you know what? Yeah, of my entire set of knowledge and expertise and skills and opportunities in that moment in time, I had the opportunity to be playing music and releasing an album and building, a collector base for my art. I also had the opportunity to be making delicious mochas and serving them to people who like to come back to my coffee shop because we liked to connect with each other. And like, that's beautiful and valid also. And that day job was an ally. That day job was giving me, it was affording me the stability, the creative freedom, the time and space to become the artist that I was becoming.
Yes.
And when I began to treat that day job with gratitude, like, it's part of my origin story, right? Like, I can't afford a keyboard without it. Like, I've got to have it. And as soon as I began to see it not as a threat to my creative identity, but as a tool that supported the development of my creative identity, then all the resistance sort of falls away and you go, yeah, okay, I'm going to go serve coffee for a few hours and then I'm going to go make some music. This is great. This is my life. This is my day today. And, you know, even today, 10 years later, there are still parts of my life where I make choices based around my values, based on my desire for stability, based on my financial commitments to my family. And instead of villainizing those choices, to be able to say, yeah, I'm one 3D person with a bunch of facets to my life and a bunch of different things that are driving me, and all of those things are valid, and all of those things are living within this ecosystem that is harmonious, and I can allow it to be harmonious. That's where I find even less resistant. Like, then when I'm doing the things that I really, really do care about, you know, when I'm working with a coaching client that's just lighting me up, or when I'm making a painting that I'm just so proud of, like, in those moments, then I'm available to enjoy the reward and joy and excitement and happiness of that, because I'm no longer burdened by like resentment or a sensation of like failure or whatever else it was that I was layering on top of myself the entire time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think the lesson is that everything that happens can be a springboard into what we want to have happen next. Like, it's really that simple.
Yeah.
Like, it's all fuel for moving in the direction that we want to move in. And the only thing that stops us is the ego stuff we were talking about. Like, when we feel we have to prove ourselves to the world, and when we become outcome dependent, basically, instead of outcome independent. For me, outcome independent means that we are investing our self-worth in some external thing happening. So, for example, maybe you're an artist or an author or something, you want your art to be received in a certain way, and you've decided, purely because of arbitrary emotional reasons, really, you've decided that you're not going to feel good about yourself until that happens. And then that just distorts the view of everything that happens instead. And then you become resentful and judgmental, and you're not grateful for what you've got. And then that takes you out of the flow, and it stops you springboarding with what you've got into where you actually need to be. And so it's all about that, in my opinion, just the choices we make to kind of stay present and to keep growing towards that vision, something like that. So
well said.
Well, thank you. But now I'm going to challenge you to sum up everything we've talked about, if that's even possible. Have you got, like, how would you sum all this up? What's the main theme of this conversation? Have you got any final words of wisdom? And can you let people know where they can find your website as well, please? And anything else you want to share?
Absolutely. Let's see. I think if I was going to sum up the last 45 minutes here, it might take me 45 more minutes to sum up everything we covered.
Well, we can die soon, so we don't have 45 minutes.
We don't have 45 minutes. Let's go. I think it would come back to the fact that we're working with a finite amount of time. We're working within our very personal realities. And the more honest we can be about what we want to make of that and why we want to make what we want to make, the more clearly we can begin to align ourselves to the things that are really the most important. And the easier that will make it for us to create the work that we feel called to create. And that deep digging conversations like this one might be the medicine if we're feeling frustrated or stuck or blocked, because sometimes the deeper challenges we face have to have deeper answers to resolve them. And so if I was going to encourage a listener to take a step out of this, because it's nice to take these big abstract things and make it something that's like concrete and doable, I would encourage someone to sit down and really take stock of their relationship with their creativity. And, not in a self-judgmental way. We're not giving ourselves a grade or a score, but to sit down and just really honestly ask, how am I doing? How am I relating to my creativity? Am I going in the direction that I want to go? And is it feeling the way I want it to feel?
Yeah.
And to just let that answer come honestly and to just receive wherever they are in the moment and meet themselves where they are and move from there and start to more intentionally build the relationship that they want to have with their creativity. If someone, this is really my favorite stuff. I'm so passionate about this, and I just feel like any artist can benefit from having that honest checkpoint with themselves. And so I actually made a tool that folks can use. It's completely free. You don't even need an email to download it. It's totally just a free gift. But I made a self-assessment tool that helps people take a pulse on their creative well-being. And it's 10 questions long, takes about 10 minutes to complete. And it gives you a holistic picture of where you might be really strong in your creative relationship or where there might be places that you could make some changes to set yourself up for more fulfillment over the long run. So I call it my spark or sputter test. It's, again, totally free. It's at laurenspangler.com/spark. So that's one place people get introduced to me and my work. It's a good place to start. And if you go down, I hope it helps you shine light on some things that'll improve your creative well-being over time. The other place to connect with me, if you want to see what's happening in my studio this week, I do hang out on Instagram. I'm at Lauren Spangler, and I would love to connect there too.
Awesome. So I'm going to share both of those links in the show notes. But Lauren, this has been a really good one. I feel like it's just flowed really well. So thank you for bringing that energy to allow us to do that. And I feel like I should wrap this up somehow in a humorous way. I'll say something about death. I don't know.
Ring the death bell again.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There we go. We're all going to die. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Oli. This has been a total blast. It's been the highlight of my day. I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope this conversation helps people.
Thank you so much once again, Lauren. That was awesome.